Cinemagoers in 1975 who ventured in to see the first feature film produced by Monty Python's Flying Circus, entitled Monty Python and the Holy Grail, would have seen many intentionally ludicrous scenes. King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, for instance, didn't have any horses and instead rode around knocking coconut shells together to make it sound like they were galloping. Another sketch provides a take on the absurdity of the witch hunts in medieval times.
What makes you think she's a witch?
Well, she turned me into a newt.
A newt?
I got better.
But amongst the most iconic scenes is surely that involving the killer rabbit of Caerbannog, a fairly small white rabbit that kills 3 of the knights and injures several others, causing King Arthur to order his men to retreat in its wake. Only after calling upon the powers of the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch are Arthur and his knights able to defeat the malevolent bunny rabbit. Now, of course, that seems like an absurd scenario. However, many medieval scholars have since pointed out that the ever-highbrow Pythons were sprinkling in some very clever literary references here. You see, the killer rabbit of Caerbannog was based on a strange feature of numerous famous illuminated manuscripts of the late medieval era, ones which often portray killer rabbits vividly in the marginal illustrations. A good place to start when it comes to assessing these medieval killer rabbits is the Smithfield Decretals. The Smithfield Decretals is an illuminated manuscript held in the British Library in London. These types of manuscripts got their name from the fact that their pages were illuminated by decorating them with colourful illustrations of one type or another. At its most basic, this might involve making the first letter in the first word on the page a very large size and illustrating it ornately with different coloured inks. More often than not, an illuminated manuscript will also include colourful drawings in the margins or in specifically allocated sections of the pages. As a result, these manuscripts are one of the great art forms of medieval Europe. The Smithfield Decretals are one of many thousands of illuminated manuscripts extant today. What's especially peculiar about the appearance of drawings of killer rabbits in this manuscript is that the subject matter of the book was otherwise quite serious. The Smithfield Decretals are a copy of the Decretals of Pope Gregory XI. These were drawn up in the 1230s on the orders of Pope Gregory by St. Raymond of Peñafort, a Dominican cleric, and comprise an updated anthology of church or canon law. The Smithfield Decretals, a volume containing over 300 pages of Gregory's decretals, were actually compiled by a cleric named John Betail in southern France in the early 14th century. The volume was taken to England not long afterwards and ended up at the religious priory of St. Bartholomew at Smithfield in London, thus acquiring the name. It was probably here that the illustrations were incorporated into the volume. Today, it is housed in the British Library in London. They ended up here in part because of the unique nature of the illustrations on the manuscript. Throughout these pages, lethal leopards parade around on their 2 hind legs, behaving like humans. In fact, they are often chasing and hunting human prey. In one scene, for instance, we see a figure desperately fleeing from a tall rabbit that stands, preparing to unleash an arrow from a bow. In another illustration, one is holding a man close to its chest, while a second rabbit sinisterly prepares to bludgeon him with a mace. Elsewhere, a man is being decapitated by a rabbit wielding a long sword, while in yet another scene, 2 bunnies are dragging a naked man who is tied up with some rope up a hill towards a gallows where they are clearly going to hang him. The scenes continue throughout the book. One even involves a man being held between two rabbits while a third sits before them as though it is a judge adjudicating on the man's fate. It's all quite jarring in its own way, not just because we're seeing scene after scene of killer rabbits running amok, but because there is such a strange contrast between the pictures and the actual text of the manuscript. A question quickly emerges. Why on earth are there images of horrible hares and raucous rabbits all over a manuscript primarily concerned with medieval canon or church law? Strangely enough, the images of the killer rabbits in the margins of the Smithfield decretals are not that unusual. There are a more robust example of the form, but it was quite common for medieval illuminated manuscripts to be decorated in the margins and other blank spaces by bizarre scenes of animals, trees, humans, and nature. And maybe even Yoda, apparently. These satirical images are known as drolleries, on account of their often humorous or absurd nature. The word derives from the French term drollerie, meaning a joke. Drolleries are small images of any kind which might be included in a manuscript in this way, sort of a medieval meme. Often they focused on the idea of the world being turned upside down or the natural order of things being inverted. So, the Smithfield decretals are a classic example, one which shows a world in which killer rabbits have taken on the guise of the hunters, while humans have become the hunted. Animals were a common feature of such drolleries. For instance, in the Galston Psalter, another late medieval illuminated manuscript in the British Library, we see images of animals engaged in unusual activities. In another, known as the Macclesfield Psalter, which was produced right around the same time as the Smithfield decretals in the 14th century, giant skates and other fish and mammals terrorise humans. Thus, there is no shortage of examples of drolleries in later medieval manuscripts, and the killer rabbits of the Smithfield decretals fit within an established tradition of amusing marginalia that sits alongside much more sombre religious texts. Other examples of things which might be included as drolleries are the signs of the zodiac or things which symbolise the passage of the seasons or other elements of the calendar. For instance, it is not uncommon to find pictures showing how medieval peasants lived around the vagaries of the annual harvest. Others could involve references to ancient cultures and mythology. There are many other illuminated manuscripts that have drolleries featuring either killer rabbits or other animals engaged in quite spectacular behaviour. Perhaps the earliest example comes from the 1170s, a century and a half prior to when the Smithfield decretals were produced. This is found in the Arnstein Pastorale, which is catalogued as Harley Manuscript 2801 in the British Library today. Here, the letter T at the beginning of a passage has been elaborately decorated to show two rabbits hanging a man from the top of the T, which, in this instance, has been turned into a gallows or gibbet. In another manuscript that was produced in France in the early 14th century, we see images where the world has truly been turned upside down. This is in the breviary or liturgical book of Renaud de Bar. Here, the rabbits are depicted as knights jousting with one another, while some unfortunate humans have been turned into horses of a kind. One is depicted, for instance, as a half-man, half-snail figure with a rabbit astride his back, charging at another rabbit. There are hundreds of richly decorated, illuminated manuscripts from the period between the 11th and 15th centuries, which show animals of all shapes and sizes engaged in peculiar behaviour. A slightly less comedic but richly decorated example is the Aberdeen Bestiary, a volume produced around the year 1200 in Scotland, which King Henry VIII of England acquired over 3 centuries later. Here, Animals of various kinds appear on nearly every page, some being mythical creatures like griffins or phoenixes. Trees and other aspects of nature are also presented in peculiar and ornate ways. What all of this points toward is a society that had a very different impression of nature. Today we view nature as something we have conquered and gained mastery over, and instead need to try and preserve as much as possible. However, to people of the Middle Ages who lived with the constant threat of famine and violence, one in which a wolf attacking a village's sheep or rabbits laying waste to a field of crops overnight could make the local food supply precarious for weeks or months to come. Such images of wild and violent animals reflected psychological concerns about how precarious their own place in the world was. This was a society that had not managed to gain mastery over nature yet, and their anxieties about this manifested themselves in peculiar ways in the margins of their manuscripts. While some took this very seriously, others took a more wry stance and created medieval memes that would circuitously end up in a Monty Python film. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed that, may I recommend that you check out our sister channel, Well I Never Stars. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, Well I Never.